I am here to try to explain systemic racism. Now, there are countless books and TED Talks and lectures, and this is a topic that is all over, but what I haven't seen is taking the best arguments from all perspectives and condensing it down into one video, which is what I'm going to attempt to do, because I am not more of an expert than world-renowned economists or social scientists or anything like that. Okay, if you want to get a perspective of how systemic racism is a myth, you can find that. If you want to get a perspective about how systemic racism permeates everything in American culture, you can get that. What I'm trying to do is take all of it and condense it down, because I've read it. I have read and consumed and watched all of these perspectives, and I looked for overlap, and I'm going to try and share the deepest truth about the issue of systemic racism with you. Geography, socioeconomic standing, and all of those types of things are going to play a role in this. And I'm going to have to leave a lot of things out to try to explain this to you. But this should be a starting point with some shared values and something where everybody can go, okay, I feel represented in that view of systemic racism to one extent or another. The way that I used to explain this was with something called the race, that essentially, and there's videos like on YouTube of this, where white people got a head start in the race, and black communities had to wait. They were held behind in the race through slavery, then Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff before they could finally get started. But instead of thinking about this like a race, what I think about it is like the race apartment building. And that's the metaphor I'm going to stick with for this video, is that it's an apartment building, and there's floors at the top and there's floors at the bottom. And the floors at the top have some leaky pipes. And when they take a hot shower or something like that, the pipes leak. Their apartment doesn't get flooded, but the water floods, and there's more leaky pipes the further down you go, and it all falls more on the bottom floors. And the bottom floors are disproportionately black. That is not saying that there aren't white people at the bottom floors, there aren't Asian people at the bottom floors, or Latino people at the bottom floors. Everyone exists on the bottom, but certain communities, including the black community, exists disproportionately higher numbers on the bottom floors. So what happens at the top floors to give them comfort trickles down negatively to those at the bottom. That is at the core of an idea behind systemic racism. So the goal is to rise up the floors of the apartment building. The way that you do this is with tools and networking. And when you are at the top floors, you have access to more tools. Okay, those tools could be a whole bunch of things. It could be reading, personal finance, knowledge. It could be a lot of things, how to interact in certain groups and stuff like that. But it's also networking, the people you see in the hallway, the people you connect with. That if you come from a lineage where your great-grandparents were able to hustle and bust their butt to get to that top floor, you're born into that top floor, you are more likely to be surrounded by people in your hallway who can hook you up with certain things. You know this person, they're in higher positions, they've been at the top floor. If you are born into the bottom floor, you have to rise up those floors with tools and networking, but you're not surrounded by the tools and networks that the people at the top are. Also, the ones that do rise up, unfortunately, are viewed as the exception rather than the example. And I think what we need to look at is what happened that you were able to go from the bottom floors to the top. And even though they are the exception, they are also oftentimes examples. It isn't as simple as winning the lottery. There are certain mindsets that the people in those bottom floors of the apartment have adopted to get them to rise up the apartment building hierarchy. So part of the reason why the concept of systemic racism is so polarized is because of politics. The Democrats and the Republicans both have their standard stance when it comes to systemic racism, essentially that the Democrats say that it is a thing and the Republicans say that it isn't. Well, I've watched a lot of conservative videos, and what they point to is that there are bad policies pushed forth by the Democrats. that a lot of the policies, whether that's affirmative action or welfare programs or whatever it might be, those actually make the situation worse. And the reason why there is any kind of systemic racism or why these inconsistencies exist is because of Democratic policies. I mean, there is some truth to that. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he famously said to his aides, "I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years." So that is part of it. But then you go over to the Republican side. Well, what are the Democrats saying? The Democrats, which overwhelmingly more people in the black community vote Democrat, they're saying the Republicans are pushing this pick yourself up by the bootstrap stuff. They're saying no help. Don't offer any help for these people in the bottom floors. They'll sink or swim. You can rise up. Come on, Obama rose up. Whatever, Kevin Hart, Michael Jordan, they rose up, so you can rise up too. So what I see, this political polarization is one side is saying the policies of that side are wrong and doing bad things. The other side is saying you're not offering any kind of help or any kind of policies, and that's what's causing it. And they're both kind of true. Another issue that I do want to bring up when it comes to systemic racism is the reality that things have changed. There's a concept called prevalence-induced concept change, which is essentially as an occurrence becomes more and more rare, we start to adopt things into that category that wouldn't have been adopted into it previously. So this is something in social science where we start to bring things in that wouldn't have been a threat before or considered systemic racism 50 years ago, and we start to bring that into being considered systemic racism today. We have different standards than we did before. There are two ways to really look at this, and I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. One is we have come a long way. And again, politically, this is the more Republican conservative side, is look how far we've come. True. I mean, even just within my lifetime, I was born in the early 1980s. We've come a long way when it comes to racism and race relations and things like that. And we have a long way to go. Those can hold the same ground. We can say that we've come a long way and we have a long ways to go. Those don't have to be opposing, and it doesn't make sense actually that they're opposing. Generational wealth and how to find success is something that is learned over time and through multiple generations, is when you've worked your way up. So you are the Kevin Hart, Michael Jordan. You've gotten from the bottom floor up to the top floor. You know how to do that, and you can share that with your kids. You can share that with your community. Okay? So people who have a history that their great-great-great-grandfather went from the bottom floor up to the top, now, for several generations, they have shared that knowledge with other people at the top, and that knowledge is helping them to stay at the top. There is something in the people who rose from the bottom floors up to the top, because it's so difficult to do, that they have this hustler mentality. They have this just like go-getter mentality of like, I am going to rise to the top. I'm going to push, I'm going to push, I'm going to push. And that's in their genetic code to some degree, and that's going to get passed on. So if you are an immigrant, came to this country through really hard means to get to this country so you can hustle and live up the American dream, that is in you to some degree. And if you were born into poverty, let's say in the African American community, you were born into the lower class. You didn't come to America to fight for a better life. You were just born into this. And we see this across racial lines too, with white people who are born into the middle class. They don't have that go-getter hustler mentality all the time. I'm from the middle class of suburban Pennsylvania, and I don't have that entrepreneurial like go-getter mentality naturally. It's like, why take those massive entrepreneurial risks when you don't have to? But when you look throughout history, slavery, then black codes, different laws for black people in the South especially, okay? Then there's Plessy versus Ferguson. Like, one of the things that is consistent in all of this is segregation, keeping people separate, sharing the knowledge of those tools and networks. One of the things that Terry Crews recently said on his Twitter is that we need white people for this equality. And he caught a lot of flack for that, but I think he's right to some degree. not the great white hope. That concept I disagree with. But the concept of not just white people, but people at the top, people in the top floors need to share the information with the people on the bottom of how to lift up from the bottom floor. This is how this needs to get done, is you say, here's what you can do to rise up. And then you share that knowledge that is typically only shared on the top floors. It's only shared among the hallways of the top floors. But if we can use the internet and the tech around today to share that information down in a way that is consumable and digestible, then we can bring the bottom up. And it's really important that we have the people on the top floors be the ones who have earned their place there. We want a hierarchy of competency in society. We want the wealthiest and the most successful people to be the ones who are contributing the most. That's what we want. And that is only going to happen if we make an even playing field to get the ones who are the best minds and the hardest workers to be able to have a pathway from the bottom up to the top. But within segregation, when you are separated from those ideas and different people, this is going to have manifestations in your mind. Part of the reason why 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was unanimously approved for desegregation by the United States Supreme Court is not because Linda Brown's school was much worse. It actually wasn't. But they used the doll test. And they showed that when you are isolated from other ideas and other perspectives and other races, then you start to take on certain mentalities and perspectives that might not be good. So integration is the key. Conversation is the key. Integration from the top floors down to the bottom floors. The top floor needs to have a party and invite the bottom floors up. The bottom floors need to have a party and invite the top floors down. And you need to interact and exchange ideas. And that is essentially one of the ways out of systemic racism. This is a very tricky issue. And part of that is because the social science behind systemic racism is not very good. And that's a frustration of mine because I believe that our society is systemically racist to some degree. I believe in this apartment building complex metaphor to a certain degree. But unfortunately, those studying race in critical race theory and stuff like that, I don't think are doing a very good job. They're tapping into, well, clearly systemic racism is real. I experience it every day, or I see people experiencing it every day. I feel it to be true, so therefore it's true. But when it comes to science, feeling it, it doesn't hold water. You can't play that game when it comes to science. You have to get credible information. I made a video that breaks down open carry of an AR-15 between a black man and a white man. And you can check out the video. In that, I am very frustrated because why is YouTube doing this social science? Why don't we have great social scientists on the race issue? Why aren't we really tackling this to try and get good data? Because what's happening is the people that say systemic racism is a myth, they just go to, where's the data? Where's the statistics? Look at these statistics. Look at those statistics. And the statistics support that there is no systemic racism. So that puts us in a really tough spot. Is if people know that it's real, but don't have proof in data and hard social science, then where are we at? And that feels like where we're at right now. I think moving forward, I will advise you to seek disconfirmation, which means if you believe that systemic racism is real and permeates everything in society, then go down a rabbit hole of learning all of the perspectives from the other side. And there are some very, very reasonable people that believe that systemic racism is not real or is a myth or is something caused by Democrats. And if you believe that systemic racism is a myth and you're on the conservative side perhaps, or you don't think that it's a real thing, then seek disconfirmation the other way. And that might come from having a lot of really genuine, curious conversations with individuals. That might be hanging out, go out as the only white person with 4 or 5 black people and be observant of how society is kind of treating you. And I think that this is, again, going back to my earlier videos of you have to feel and think your way through this one, but have some genuine curiosity and have some intellectual humility that this is extremely complicated, and we need good social science, and we need to feel this one through, that the concept of systemic racism is not simple. And anyone that says it's simple is not accurate on either side. And I hope that this video is a starting point of conversation and challenging your own thinking, because I have consumed thousands of hours on both sides of this issue, and I'm very confused by it. But I believe that that is the way out of this, is to really understand all sides, have some conversations, and then we can move forward from here. So thank you for watching. Please check out my other videos.